questions that they want. Now, I am going to, as I do with my wife, pretend that silence means everything I said is approved. So I don't see any questions popping up. And it looks like some of the ones that were asked were addressed in the tablet. So let's go ahead and move forward and talk about effective questions. Now I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Anne, who is going to introduce herself and talk to us about effective questions.
Hello and good afternoon. Steve, were you going to still be driving and I'll...
That's not yet. I had forgotten about that, and yes, I am. Let me go back to me. I apologize.
No worries. And while Steve's pulling it up, I saw one of the great questions on Padlet said, how can I help my students craft effective or quality questions? And we are going to begin to address what effective questions are and what the components of an effective question and types of effective questions that drive inquiry are. And this webinar specifically is about teachers reading those inquiry-based questions, but we do want to eventually get to the point where we're helping our students and guiding our students to be able to craft the effective questions that will guide their own inquiry. Okay, so Steve, are we ready to proceed with the effective questions?
I hope that helped.
Okay, I don't hear you at all anymore, so I'm guessing that you're just going to be pulling it up as I present it. Okay, as for effective questions, what's most important is that they capture issues that are important to our students. The planned daily lessons and activities, we want students to be engaged, and we want them to want to be able to have a relevancy and a reason and a purpose as to why these lessons are so important to them. So we want to make sure that these questions capture the issues that they see as issues and problems in their own world. We also want to make sure that they're aligned to our essential standards and that they are requiring students to be exposed to the necessary content in order to be able to answer these questions effectively. Additionally to that, we want to make sure that effective questions are proactive as opposed to reactive. We want them to be rethinking the big ideas. We don't want a question that would be at all I'm going to say this before, Googleable. And by that we mean we don't want a lot of our students nowadays to simply put the question right into the Google search bar and come up with an answer. A good question cannot be answered via a Google search engine. Effective questions should also address real dilemmas, things that are going on and could apply in multiple settings, whether it be something they saw on the evening news or something that they're going to learn both a social studies class and a science class, or something that's going on in their personal life or what they see in their near future. Also, we want to make sure that they're interested and that they look at the content and say, you know, this is pretty cool, and I see why we're doing this, and I understand why it's so important that we're studying this content, or why it's so important that we're looking at this content. We want to make sure that the effective questions spark meaning and maybe tap into the students' prior knowledge and experiences that they have or that are relevant and pertain to them. We also want to make sure that the effective question will help organize the inquiry. We're hoping that a good question often leads to more questions and deeper research. And that inquiry question is going to, we often reference it as something that drives or motivates students because it's something that's going to continue to guide where their research is going to lead them and the lens through which they'll look at all the content that they're going to be exposed to. So, the different types of questions, there's 4 that we're going to be addressing here today. The first is philosophical, and an example of a philosophical question is, when is war justified? And it pretty much asks the big question that will have multiple answers, not only want. And the most important thing is that the student present both sides or choose a side and is able to justify it through research. A second type of question could be one that we reference as one that has a product. For example, how can we plan an event that creates or celebrates the history of our community? So in a product question, we want students to maybe come up with a solution or a means, a way in which something that they're going to have to create in order to either showcase or be able to provide an example of a sufficient or effective means of doing something. Which leads us well into the problem-solving question. And I'll say personally, this is probably one of my favorites. Because a question that presents a problem for a student will really make them grapple with it. It shouldn't be something that's easy for any of us to answer. And it should be something that takes a lot of multiple perspectives in order to arrive at our conclusion. So a good example of problem-solving question would be, why do civilizations fail? Well, obviously they're going to have multiple means or reasons, but we want to make sure that they're being able to, once again, being able to document it. Next, and finally, in terms of different types of questions, is that it's a real-world scenario. So, for example, what responsibilities, if any, does the government have in maintaining the middle class? It's something that might be something in which they're facing on a day-to-day basis that you're also going to be addressing in your social studies class and maybe multiple classrooms as to how they might want to begin to think about how their generation is going to address something. So those are the four types of questions that we want you to keep in mind. Okay, the next thing that we're looking at here is some examples of questions from multiple disciplines. We want inquiry to not just be, while social studies is the great place to begin and to drive all other instruction, we want it to also be able to be something that seeps into all areas and studies of their life. So you'll see here how justice, being an example, can also then expand into other areas. For instance, I love the example in English, why are books banned? How do we persuade others? How does literature reflect the time in which this was written? Clearly, the social studies connections are evident there. Art, always a wonderful place in order to make connections in terms of how art reflects culture and history and the idea of should it be censored? Does it need to be censored? So these are some things that we want you to consider when you begin to create those questions to guide inquiry in your classrooms. I hope that wasn't too fast, and before we proceed to the next part, I would like to just stop, and if there's any questions, we'll address them at this time. And I do also, I love that quote, sure, but if you're asking questions, the students can answer on the phone, so you're asking the wrong question. Great. All right, Steve, I guess we're going to turn it back to you then if there's no other questions.
Okay, great. So what we're going to do now is we're going to look at some examples of correct or incorrect questions, I should say, and ways to refine questions, right? And we talked about some of these already, right? And touched on already with that wonderful word Googleable, right? So we're going to look at, for example, how to turn a Googleable question, Googleable, into an open-ended question. Look at how teacher language can be turned into something that's more engaging for students, because let's be honest, teacher language is often not the most, shall we say, engaging language for our kids. And actually tied to teacher language would be things that are too content specific or too tied directly to the standards. Quoting the standards, for example, in the question. And how do we make that more relevant for students? And then just how do we go from a general question to something that's a little more charged for action, tying into that dimension of the C3 framework that actually asks for students to take action, civic action, as it were. So let's go ahead and look at Googleable type questions, okay? So let's look at this first one right here. What are the major industries in our state? And let's look at this question and think about the fact that, let's be honest, this question is something you can just type into Google, what are the major industries in our state, and get some answers back. And I'll point out here, too, one thing to remember is, while Google is a wonderful thing, some of our kids don't realize that sometimes the answers you get back to the questions you type in are not exactly the most accurate things. Right? So now what I'd like to do is, let's go ahead and go to Padlet, right? So if we go to our Padlet link and think about that question, what are the major industries in our state? And pull up Padlet here. There we go. So the question is, what are the major industries in our state? Can somebody or anybody here in the Padlet turn this into a question that is perhaps not so Googleable, but still related to this question? I'm going to go ahead and type one in and see what you think. So as an example there, why does our state produce the things that it does? Anybody have any other examples? And we're going to look at a couple more examples of Googleable questions and ways to fix them. But just keep in mind that questions that are very concrete are ones we sort of really want to avoid. Right? And Googleable questions are ones that do not require multiple activities, do not really synthesize multiple perspectives, or require much analysis. We want to go beyond that into a deeper meaning. So actually, I see somebody there wrote, how could the civil rights movement be more effective? And again, that would be a non-Googleable question, certainly. Well, there's no one right way to address this, but so let's look at a couple more Googleable questions. What were the causes of the American Revolution? Right? And what were the major forms of modern art? These are all Googleable questions. These are concrete questions that students can simply type in Google and get an answer. And if the correct answer, they can get an answer relatively easy. Right? And generally, of course, everybody's favorite online encyclopedia, Wikipedia, which, as we know, has issues of its own. So how do we turn these into more open-ended questions? Well, here's an example. Why does our state produce the things that it does? We saw that one. Could England have avoided the revolt of the American colonies? And now if we look at that, could England have avoided the revolt of the American colonies? Right? That would still get to the causes of the American Revolution, but it gets deeper. It asks students to think deeper about those causes and the consequences, really, if you think about it, of English actions. And the last one, does modern art reflect or inspire society? Right? And, I love this question. We actually debated this question quite a bit when we were working on this presentation. And I think a lot of us fell in love with this particular question. But that's another thing that we need to keep in mind, too, is when we're trying to really think about questions, we should be collaborating when we can on creating these sorts of questions. And we should encourage our students to collaborate on creating questions once we reach that point. Right? And if you have any other examples of questions that might not be so Googleable, then we encourage you to go ahead and post them in the Padlet link too. Either rewriting those Googleable questions we shared with you, or creating your own non-Googleable questions, because we're always interested in wonderful non-Googleable questions. And I also just like saying Googleable. So, I'm going to go ahead and we're going to turn it back over to Justin, who is going to go ahead and talk about sounding too much like a teacher.